The Lord be with you. Can you hear me? The Lord be with you. The Lord be with you. Boy, that's really good, isn't it? Throw it down some. Okay. Let's begin with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you for being here. This is our last session on the prodigal species comes home. And today I want to do something that is kind of new, in the sense of telling a great story that not only includes Christianity, but includes all religions and includes also scientific evidence. And this is a work in progress. I'm drawing on several sources for this. Much of the science comes from David Christian and Judy Canato. Much of the kind of archaeological work comes from Jeremy Rifkin, Steve Taylor, E.O. Wilson, and several others that I have long forgotten but still remember some of the stuff that was about. And this story that I'm going to tell you could not have been told any earlier because we didn't know that much earlier. That is to say that scientific evidence that's come over the past, even 30 or 40 years has changed our understanding of things, and in my opinion, has confirmed Christianity. I'm telling this story because I believe it will deepen our faith and it will help us to bring our differences together because we can see the focus of things as being the same. So, again, this is a work in progress, and where I am right now might not be where I am tomorrow, but this is where I am right now. And I'd like for you to imagine first darkness. Think of the most or the darkest place you've been, and I mean no light, the darkest place. And then I want you to multiply that by 1 billion trillion. And that's where things begin. 13.7 billion years ago, there was nothing. Okay? In the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And the light flared forth from this one small point, no bigger than the point of a pin. And a flaring forth of light energy went everywhere in all directions. And immediately, distinct things began to appear. Some of the energy broke down into forces, including gravity and electromagnetism. And some of these photons of energy came together to form relationships we call protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then as the world began to, or as the universe began to expand even more and began to cool, these electrons and protons came together to form the basic, simplest atom, hydrogen. And there was hydrogen everywhere. And there was nowhere until the hydrogen got there. And these hydrogen atoms began to form clouds together because gravity was pulling them together. And as they got hotter and hotter, eventually the temperature reached 10 million degrees. And the protons in the hydrogen began to fuse together to form helium. And when they did, they let off energy, light energy, and the stars appeared. The stars began turning on here and there and everywhere, all through the universe. There were billions of stars. Some of the stars were small, and they lasted a short period of time. A long period of time, billions of years. Some of the stars that were really large ended up using their oxygen, using their hydrogen up. And everything turned to helium, and then everything began to be pulled in by gravity until it blew up. And the heat was so intense that the protons began to make different arrangements so that the whole periodic table of elements was spewed out in what we call a supernova. Now, not too far from here, 5 billion years ago, a supernova exploded and all of the elements came out. And if you're wearing a gold ring, you have a part of it right there. Your whole body is made out of it, actually, because it's all the elements that came out. And all these elements, or the supernova, actually lit a cloud of hydrogen atoms that became our sun. And all these materials began to move around the sun. And they bumped into each other. And one of the big bumps created a moon for one of those planets that we happen to call Earth. And the planets began twirling around, and the world became more complex, more relationally complex. Now, life began, and it takes certain things for life to happen. First is it needs energy, but not too much energy. And that's why planets are good for that. Sun has too much energy for life to take place. But on a planet like Earth, it can, because there's just the right amount, Goldilocks conditions, as people say. And there needs to be lots of different elements, which is present on Earth. And then there needs to be liquids. And the reason there needs to be liquids, because for life to come together, there has to be molecules that can, or atoms that can hook up to become molecules. And in gases, they're going too fast to hook up, to come into relationship. But in water, they're able to kind of cruise along and find relationships together. And in Earth, there were these great oceans. And at the bottom of the oceans, there were these cracks in the Earth's crust where enormous amounts of heat came out, and all the different elements came out. And it's there that life began. Now, the interesting part about this is, and of course, in my opinion, we have to include God's ability to bring that life about, because God is working through all of this. But something quite amazing happened. When a molecule is formed, how do you keep that molecule stable? And the choice was not to make the individual stable, but to create a template that would stabilize the molecule. A template that had information that would tell the molecule how to be. This template we call DNA, the double helix that most of you are familiar with watching TV. And this template, or we might say logos, is the information about how molecules become living cells. And the interesting part about this is that this template divides itself. It multiplies as it divides. And after every billion divisions, there's an error in the way that it's put together. And that error causes different things to happen. Sometimes they're adaptable to the environment around them, sometimes they are not. But this is what creates complexity. Complexity and diversity in life. At the beginning, there was just single cells. But along about 541 million years ago, there was this gigantic explosion of life here on Earth. Life in the seas particularly, it was everywhere. All kinds of different life. All the different phyla that we are used to were here. And then everything got cold. And there was a mass extinction. About 70% died. But then resurrection. More complex life comes to be. And then there's another extinction and more life comes to be. And it's the fifth extinction that is most important for us. The dinosaurs were ruling the world. Millions of years ruling the world. And an asteroid hits the Yucatan Peninsula and causes such a ruckus that the climate is changed again and the dinosaurs die and mammals arise. And the mammals begin to take over where the dinosaurs were not. And one of the mammals got DNA working double time. And what DNA did in one mammal was to increase the brain capacity to such a degree that now learning could be passed on. In most animals, they learn as they live, but then when they die, the learning is gone. But now a different way of complexity has come about. In human beings, there's this possibility to communicate learning with others so that learning begins to grow and culture begins to complexify. Human beings as we know them today, Homo sapiens, began about 200,000 years ago. And most of them were hunter-gatherers, or gatherer-hunters is probably a better way to put it, because the gathering produced about 80% of the food and the hunting produced about 20% of the food. So they really ought to be gatherer-hunters. And they lived that way for thousands of years because there was plenty to eat. There was plenty to be a part, and they would roam around and they would move when it got cold, and they'd go south to Florida or someplace like that, you know, and find food down there. You know how it goes. And this happened for thousands and thousands of years. 10,000 years ago, they got the idea of horticulture, and that is not mass farming like we have it today, but just being able to sit in the same place, be in the same place and grow your own food in that sense. And it was all very local, still very tribal, very kind of family-oriented in that sense. But then the climate began to change in one of those fertile areas that where a lot of people had settled. And I'm talking about the area in northern Africa, up through the Mideast, through the Mesopotamia and the Tigris and Euphrates, and on into Asia, Central Asia. This was a fertile region that kind of held lots of people there, and it began to become arid. Deserts began to form, and the people began to struggle because they were no longer nomadic to go someplace. They liked the place where they were, but it was changing. It was becoming desert rather than fertile ground to live in. 8,000 years ago, it became really bad. And 6,000 years ago, something happened that was extraordinary. Human beings began to develop their left brains in a fantastic way. The analytical brain came into being. The ego became a part of us. And we'd always had that. We always had a sense of who we were in that sense. But this is kind of ego on steroids. And this is when creativity began to blossom everywhere. This is when the wheel was invented, when mass agriculture and irrigation was invented. This is when art just took off. This is when all of the things that we know as modern way of living started. But it had a price to pay. And the price was this, that when you begin to think of yourself as a separate self, which is what this is about, your mind becomes very creative and very active. You begin to talk to yourself. That's how you work things out, you know, and everybody has their mind racing most of the time, usually at night, about 3 o'clock, you know. And this is the way that it happened. This is what started that. And it caused in men a separation from everything. Separation even from family in lots of ways. And they began to see themselves very differently. Women maintained this sense of empathy and compassion for others because of having children and having families. But men, for some reason, many men at least, probably not all, but many, began to see things separately. And this is when war started. And this is when male dominance and patriarchy started. And this is when social status and class stratification began. And this is when we began to be afraid of death because now we realize that things die. And that fear creates this war and this dominance over others and all of that. And so 2,800 years ago, the major religions began. And they began because of this problem with the ego. They began because of war, violence, slavery, all those things that had not occurred up until then. And all the religions began to get this sense of what was right. And that rightness was a morality that began to help people to live together in right relationship again. In the East, the focus started with contemplation, with meditation. Because the ego has this constant brain traffic going, that's part of what separates us from others. We think it's just everything is in our head. And so meditation cuts that off and says, stop doing that. And there are ways, practices that help people to stop doing that so they begin to feel that connection again and begin begin to move in moral ways. That's exactly what Hinduism and Buddhism and all that are about. They start with the contemplation, and then they move to moral actions because they now see the connections that they had lost. In Judaism, which is, of course, the origin of Christianity and Islam, in Judaism, they had already started on a moral quest. Just before 800 BC, in probably 1200 BC, Moses had freed the slaves from Egypt and had brought them into a community of right relationship with each other where they didn't lord it over each other. In 800 BC, that was the time of the prophets. And the prophets began to see that the God they had been worshiping was not an angry God who wanted them to make sacrifices so that they could be brought into relationship with God. They saw that it was really about their actions with others that was important. And they said, what God wants is not your empty worship, but for you to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And Christianity is a product of that. Jesus is the one who did justice, who loved kindness, and walked humbly with his God. People called it transcending ego. Doesn't mean you let go of your ego. It just means that you begin to realize that you're not your ego, that your ego is a tool that you have. And this is who Jesus was, trans-ego, transcended his ego, and began to love and have compassion for those who had been left out, and included them back, and loved them to the very end, even to his death. And God raised him up, saying to us, this is the way. This is the way to recover that sense of oneness. It is through our sense of compassion and empathy for others. And it's not a command to do it. It is a response to the love of God. A response that allows us to begin to love each other. And you see that happening in the Christian tradition. The mainline tradition gets hoodwinked into becoming part of the empire, and the mainline kind of, what I would say, falls back into patriarchy, falls back into war, falls back into all those things that were causing all the problems. But there's a mystic tradition, a tradition that begins to see that God is love, that moved in a different direction. And all the mystics, Bonaventure, St. Richard of Victor, Teresa of Avila, Joan of Arc even, there's lots of them that have moved in a tradition of beginning to see that God is love. And then, after the Reformation, what do we see in the 18th century? We see democracy coming around. We see the French Revolution against the tyranny of one ruler. We begin to see the ending of slavery. England, I think, starts it. America certainly struggles with it. We see women's rights coming back, the right to vote. We see all these changes with the differences we have. This is the movement of the Spirit of God, helping us to become more compassionate, more empathetic with each other, so that we can see the reality, which is the true reality, that we are all in relationship with each other and with every other thing in the universe. It's all connected. Judy Canado says that our focus is communion. Our focus is always communion. One of the scientific facts that I've talked about before is that we are not wholes and we're not parts. We're whole parts. That is to say, we are always part of something more than who we think we are. Every bit of us is made up of whole parts, atoms becoming molecules, becoming cells, becoming organs, becoming systems, becoming us, becoming a part of a family, part of a communion, part of a nation, part of the world. We are whole-ons, we are whole parts, and we're a part of everything. And this is where God is leading us and has been leading us through all the religions. Some of them get off course, but if you look deeply in every one of them, you will see this mystic tradition. This mystic tradition of God is love. And how could it be differently? What is love? Love is coming into relationship. Love is dying and rising, death and resurrection. This is what love is. This is what created the universe. This is the pattern of everything. And when we get in touch with that, our souls are fed. We feel whole. The chatter in our minds can stop. Our quest for more and more of what never works can end. And we can find peace together. Amen. Responses. When? Yeah, I meant to say that, and I'm glad you brought that up because I should have mentioned the fall. The fall in the Bible fits this perfectly. If you remember the story, Adam and Eve search for knowledge, the tree of knowledge, which is exactly what the ego gives, knowledge, okay? And then what happens? They're exiled from the garden. And it's really a representation of what happened to these people. They were in this garden that they had, which provided everything they need. Then the garden was taken away, but they got this knowledge that adapted to things. And then what happens after they go out of the garden? Remember the part where it says, now you will, tells Eve that she will now feel the birth pangs of birth, and her husband will rule over her. Patriarchy. After the fall. After the fall. This isn't the only story that's like that. Even in the East, they have stories similar to that are expressing this understanding of this fall, as we say, this increase in ego, which has this wonderful good side, but it also has a very bad side as well, which is what religion comes in to help us to deal with so that we can begin to move together in that sense along with that. And I think that's what's expressed with Revelation, with the city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. It's expressing this diversity of people living together in unity in that sense. And it happens, from the fall to the resurrection, which is what we're on, the movement we're going on in that sense. And one of the things that was hard to do was to begin to mention God at all the places I saw God working, and because I didn't want to get too redundant with it in that sense. But God was working every bit of the story, all through the story. And much like the God that the tribal communities had, the Great Spirit, that they saw working everywhere and through everything. You see, it was just after the fall that we began to think about God as Zeus, you know, a strong kind of male figure that throws spears at people who mess up, you know. This is part of the fall, you know. And the Christian tradition in particular moves away from that completely. You know, from the very beginning, they are always moving toward this sense of relationality, of relationship with each other, not a top-down relation, but mutual relations. And this is what the prophets were talking about, because the leaders of Israel were not giving people that had no status any justice at all. They were just treating them like pawns. And the prophets were railing at the leaders, you've got to have justice at the gates or God is not going to like it, you know. And that's what he's talking about. And I guess Jesus embodies that for us. And the Spirit of Jesus continues to lead us in that. And you see great jumps in this, great times when compassion is overwhelming. Even is the story I told about the World War II, where they had the World War I, where the battles in the trenches, and then on Christmas Eve, they come out of the trenches and begin to greet each other and talk with each other. Remember that this is the compassion is who we are in the deepest part of who we are. Compassion of connecting to each other, and the ego hides that from us. It kind of keeps us thinking of ourselves as being separate and not needing others. But that's the opposite of what really feeds us. Yes, Alec. Yeah, okay.
I would like to make a couple of observations on what is Chris' story. Okay, thank you. Your story has been very compelling, and I see two parts. The first one is the description of the cosmic evolution. Now, I'm on the scientific side, but I think that if there was an assembly of scientists today here, they would have all applauded Chris, because in the space of 10, 12 minutes, he went in a very clear way to explain the cosmic evolution. The second part has been the social and religious evolution through the centuries. And whatever are the religions, whatever are our belief, whatever is our faith, what is important, the message that Chris gave us, is that it's very, very important to have this platform, the religion, because it satisfies the emotional needs of us human beings. And you know, there is a spectrum. Many people have strong faith, they have strong beliefs. Other people, me with my scientific mind, is always struggling with doubts. But at the same time, I do recognize that religion plays an essential role in making us feeling included, part of a community. My final observation is about something that Chris mentioned in the previous sessions. The condition of our planet Earth. We need to open our mouth. We need to learn more, because what is happening to Earth now is very, very difficult for the future. And if no action is taken, the future generations will pay dearly for it. if there is enough interest, and maybe there won't be, I don't know, but I would be happy to share with you in a half an hour, 40 minutes, what are the fundamental facts today that climate change has brought on the table. So that's all.
Thank you, Rocco. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else have something? About out of time. Say that again.
The idea of God came from men's brains.
Not God in general. The people, the tribal people had a wonderful understanding of God's presence with them. The spirit, the Native Americans, the great spirit that was a part of everything. And that is, I think, a better understanding than thinking about God as Zeus, which is what we've really kind of mostly thought about. Even after Jesus, we still thought about God as Zeus, God as all-powerful, all-controlling, all doing, getting back at people who don't do the right thing and so forth. That's the ego, yeah. But God has revealed to us who God is in Jesus, which is the opposite of that. That God is this relational existence or relational being, the ground of being. God is relational. You can feel it in everything you do once you get out of your left brain. You know what I mean? You begin to hear the word coming to you when your left brain stops chattering, in that sense. And this is where the prophets, all the prophets were shepherds, or a lot of them were shepherds. And if you're a shepherd, you're out in the middle of nowhere, no TV, nothing of that, And so you're not occupied, and you begin to feel what's there. The Christian tradition tells us that God is not a being, another being in the universe, but the ground of being itself, a part of it, calling us. And you hear that call in your brain. That's what's so remarkable about this, that you feel it, you hear it. Joan of Arc, when she was put on trial, they said, "Aren't you listening to yourself when you hear God speak?" And she says, "Well, how else is God going to speak to me?" That God speaks through our brains are not just something in here. They're really connections to the world around us, connections to God in that sense. So it's as Jason was saying today, our God is too small. Our God has created a universe that we can't even get our heads around. And we're talking about 1 billion galaxies with 1 billion stars each is where we are right now. This is incomprehensible for most of us in that sense. But it gives us a sense of the awesomeness of God. The radical amazement is what the word that Judy Canado uses, that we are radically amazed at a God who can create this kind of universe, that kind of sustains itself, but that God's presence is in it, a persuasive presence that calls us human beings at least, back to compassion and empathy for each other, to begin to become a person that's connected to not only other people, but the world itself, because we came from the world. Others?
Bob had a question.
Who? Oh, okay, Bob.
These really remarkably wonderful things
I was saying these really wonderful things that you're presenting and the manner in which you're doing that. And it occurs to me that the Bible is full of miracles. Yet it would seem that, well, what do you have a view on what the source of miracles could be?
Well, I think the miracles in the Bible are things that we can't really explain. I don't think, in scientific. You can try all you want to, but the miracle stories in the Bible, if you look closely, you will see that they are helping us to move past this ego out of control. That they're helping us to find that empathy and compassion in others. You look at, the miracle of the bread and wine, for instance. That's exactly as saying that communion is the basis of who we are as people. That communion is what life is about. We are in communion with each other and the whole world, even though we may not, quote, understand that or know or be aware of that. That communion is the basis. And most of the miracles in the Bible are told from that point of view, ways of helping us to see what's happening in a way that gets us moving with it in that sense. It's not just stories that are trying to get our attention. They're really stories that are eternally true, patterns that are eternally true, just like the fall. That's an eternal story. It is a story that every human being goes through, because all of the jumps in kind of cognition and our brains, each of us goes through as we grow up. This great happening in 6,000 years ago, it kind of corresponds to a baby becoming 2 and 3 years old. When they jump and everything is mine now. It's that kind of sense of this is mine, not yours. And that's what got us going in this, and we keep going through that. We're still. You can see the pattern of progressing away from it. I mean, we've come a long way, I think, but we still have further to go to begin to increase that empathy and compassion with each other. So we've had about enough. Anyway, I have. Thank you.